One of the most important concepts in international relations is power. But there's a lot that goes into power and how it operates, and I think we should spend some time unpacking that. So a short definition, a simple definition would be simply power is the ability to influence, right? The ability to take what you have and nudge things in the direction that you want them to go. But an expanded definition, I think a definition that certain theories, particularly realism, which again we'll talk about next week, spend a lot of time thinking about, is power as the ability to make someone do something that they otherwise would not do, particularly if they don't want to do it, right? So it's power over somebody else to change their behavior. And to figure out how to do that is really messy. Whether or not people are willing to have their behavior changed or whether they're resistant to that can be difficult to know. As a shorthand, social scientists tend to simply rely upon capabilities as a shorthand for power, right? The more capabilities you have, the tangible and intangible assets at the disposal of the state, right? Bombs that you can drop or dollars you can use to pay bribes with. Those seem to be things that correspond with power. And we oftentimes use that as a proxy for how much power a state has. And this view of power sees capabilities as fungible, things that you can just sort of spend. It's a pool of assets that you can draw on to solve any particular problem. There's some real issues with this kind of an approach to thinking about power, but I think we'll unpack that as we go through here. So if you're thinking about what the distribution of capabilities looks like in the international system, this is a rough approximation. The dark green represents states that are that have the most capabilities. The light pale green, almost white, are states that have very few capabilities, and then we have different shades of green in between. And you can look at this and say, okay, that makes a lot of sense. The United States is a powerful state, has lots of capabilities. China is a powerful state, has lots of capabilities. India, Russia, also powerful. Brazil, maybe if you add up Britain and France and Germany and Italy together, and you could maybe Spain and a few others, you get a sort of European Union kind of power block that would also be a major player. If you're curious where this comes from, this is a measure of correlates of war. It's basically an aggregate indicator of a state's power if you had to fight World War II again, if you had to mobilize your iron and steel industry, if you had to mobilize your population, if you had to crank out as much industrial capacity as you possibly could, what would that look like? And so this is, I think, a useful but maybe limited way of thinking about power. One of the reasons why I think relying upon capabilities to think about power is so limiting is that we need to think about power in context. And so having tanks is maybe useful for having power. It's capabilities, we can count them, but it's unclear sort of on the surface how many tanks constitutes a lot of tanks, right? If you are the only country that has tanks on the entire planet and you have 1 or 2 tanks, that's a lot of tanks. During the American Civil War, both the North and the South fielded iron-sided ships. They each had one, but in that one battle between the 2 ships, they essentially made every other navy on the planet antiquated or irrelevant because they had this new military technology that was able to be deployed. If you're in a situation where everybody has iron-sided ships or everybody has tanks, well, maybe 1 or 2 isn't a lot. Maybe you need 100 or maybe you need 1,000. It really depends on what other people have in terms of capabilities to be able to understand whether or not that's a lot. So power needs to be put in context. For that reason, we oftentimes think about power as zero sum, right? The more power others gain, that comes at the expense of my capabilities. It reduces the influence or the effectiveness of the resources I have to deploy. And so we're always in sort of this competition of, as you gain, I may be losing out in terms of my ability to push things in the direction that I want. So that's, I think, a really important concept to think about. We're going to come back to this idea of power as zero sum again and again and again over the course of the semester, particularly next week when we talk about realist theory. One last factor I think that's important to think about with power is that we have this idea that power is fungible, that you can just spend it on any particular problem, but that's not true. The capabilities that states have available may or may not be appropriate for a particular problem. And so at the end of World War II, when Dwight Eisenhower was elected president, he argued that the United States would be able to move away from having a large standing army. It wouldn't need to have a large standing army because the United States had nuclear weapons. And the United States would never run into military problems again because everyone would know the United States has nuclear weapons, and that would solve things. Well, Eisenhower quickly discovered that there are lots of problems out there in the international arena that you can't resolve with nuclear weapons. And so early on, the United States gets into a dispute in Guatemala where there's a new government elected that starts nationalizing banana fields that are run by United Fruit Co. And Eisenhower tries to intervene and say, stop nationalizing the plantations of this company that is based in the United States. And Guatemala says, you can't nuke us. And Eisenhower realizes, no, he can't use nuclear weapons to solve that problem. In fact, you can have lots and lots and lots of nuclear weapons, and essentially the only problem they solve is deterring other countries from launching nuclear weapons at you. They're very difficult to use in all sorts of different problems. But we find that in all sorts of different situations. In Vietnam, the United States had lots of tanks, but there were very few tank battles because jungles are not a good place to use tanks. In Iraq in 1991, the United States had lots of tanks, and they were used, and there were tank battles because Iraq is relatively flat, and there were open areas where tanks could sort of roll in at high speeds and maneuver. Whether or not you can use the resources you have at your disposal, the capabilities you have at your disposal, really can depend on the situation and the problem that you're addressing. So I think that's, again, something worth wrapping your head around. Okay, let's go back to talking about this idea of power and how you use power. We tend to think about power as having sort of two dimensions, right? There's the carrot and there's the stick. And this is sort of this metaphor about somebody who has a donkey, beast of burden, right? And you load the donkey up with lots of stuff and say, okay, donkey, now that you're loaded with all this heavy stuff, then I want you to go, carry it for me, walk. And the donkey stands there, stubborn animal that it is, and it doesn't want to carry that heavy load. How do you get the donkey to walk forward? And there's two general approaches in this metaphorical story about a donkey. One is to get a carrot, right? Donkeys like carrots, and you sort of wave the carrot in front of the donkey, say, come on, donkey, if you walk forward, I'll give you the carrot. The donkey walks forward, and you hand the donkey the carrot, and then you get another carrot, and the donkey keeps walking forward. Right? You can essentially bribe your way to power, right? Providing an incentive to someone to change their behavior so that they'll do what you want. It's actually very, very reliable. People will respond to bribes. It's costly. You do have to pay the bribe. That might not be desirable. And it can create perverse incentives to act out. And so in the early 1990s through the early 2000s, there was a raging debate in the US foreign policy community about how to respond to North Korea, which was on track to develop nuclear weapons. And initially, the Clinton administration cuts a deal with North Korea for them to shut down their uranium enrichment facilities in exchange for food and fuel and fertilizer to help keep the North Korean economy on track and to help prevent famine. Well, a couple years later, North Korea is developing a plutonium reactor that would allow them to make nuclear weapons a different way. And US foreign policy experts sort of huddled up and they said, what's going on here? And they concluded that what's going on is that North Korea was able to get a payout, essentially a bribe, to stop developing uranium. And now they're looking for another bribe. They're acting out. They're doing something that runs counter to the spirit of international agreements that they had signed onto, with the hope that the United States will again provide food and fuel and fertilizer to North Korea in exchange for them shutting down their plutonium facilities. That's a risk you might run. The other approach, if you don't like the bribery approach, is you can rely upon the stick. Going back to our metaphor of the donkey, you can pick up a stick and you can sort of brandish it menacingly, and maybe you whack the donkey, and the donkey says, I don't like that. This is a disincentive. I'm changing my behavior. If I stand here, bad things happen, or I fear bad things will happen, and so I'm going to start walking because bad things seem to happen less when I'm walking. So that's a second approach you can take. One of the nice things about using the stick is that if you threaten and your threat is believed and your threat is responded to and it's successful, then you get what you want for free. There's no cost. You don't have to follow through. But occasionally, maybe even more than occasionally, when states make threats, if you do this, I will do that, it doesn't work, and you're in a situation where you end up having to follow through. on that threat, which can be really expensive, particularly if we're talking in terms of military force. Military force is an insanely expensive way to resolve problems. It's roughly $1 million per cruise missile. It costs roughly $1 million for the United States to deploy a soldier in a combat zone for a year. Military force is incredibly expensive, and if you have to follow through, you might find yourself in a situation where you are spending way more to resolve that problem than you ever anticipated. And so one of the things that folks who think about power and think about how it operates focus a lot on is this idea of credibility. It's not just enough to have the capacity to launch cruise missiles or to impose sanctions or to field an invasion force. There also has to be the credibility component that goes with it. Does whoever you're trying to cajole or coerce or change the behavior of, do they actually believe that you will follow through on what you're saying? It's a tricky thing to pin down. A slightly different approach to thinking about power is this idea of soft power. And this relates to this article by Joseph Nye. It's up on Blackboard. I would really encourage you to read it. It's a little bit dated in terms of the examples, but it's an incredibly insightful essay into how power operates. And what Nye says is that this whole idea of the carrots and sticks, it's really wrong in that you're focusing on power over others. You're trying to control people. You're bribing them, you're hitting them with a stick, you're trying to change their behavior with incentives or disincentives. Stop it, he says. We should be thinking about power in terms of getting the outcomes that we want. Whether or not we're controlling other people's behavior is irrelevant. What we need to focus on is this idea of, do we get what we want? And there are lots of different ways to get what you want beyond controlling the behavior of others. And so Joseph Nye lays out two different approaches that he broadly describes as soft power. In sort of conventional discussion, when people talk about soft power, they talk about the first one of these, this idea that you have sort of a cultural cachet, that people are attracted to you, that they think that you are doing good things, and therefore they want to participate to be part of that program. Getting others to want the things that you want is a very powerful tool that can help sort of smooth the pathway for people to do the things that you would really like them to do anyway. And there's ways that you can cultivate this, right? You can run public diplomacy campaigns where rather than working with diplomats from other states, you are trying to create goodwill among the general population. You can run person-to-person public diplomacy where students go to other countries and study abroad and meet students in other countries, and they develop fond feelings for each other, and that translates into sort of this bubbling goodwill that then makes it easier for governments to cooperate with each other, and maybe makes it harder for a government to break diplomatic ties or break cooperative ties with this country because of this sort of foundation of goodwill that's been built up. So that's soft power, but that's not the only way that Joseph Nye talks about how we can get the outcomes that we want. He also points out that if you have the power to set and dominate the agenda, you have incredible power over how decisions get made, right? So if you control the agenda, you can essentially make sure that the things you want talked about are put at the top of the agenda and will get talked about. And items 2 and 3 and 4, maybe they'll get a few minutes. And if something's at the very, very bottom of the agenda, nobody's going to reach it. It's going to get kicked off to the next meeting, and you come to the next meeting, and there it is at the bottom of the agenda again. And you can keep an item for, out of discussion for as long as you want, as long as you continue to control that agenda. Also controlling the decision process, the rules of an organization, being able to frame the decision-making that happens, right? And I use this approach all the time with my children when trying to get them to go to bed. I say, oh, children, it's time for bed. Do you want an apple or a cookie before you go to bed? Oh, I want the cookie, the children say, and they rush to the cookie, but I haven't given them a choice about whether or not it's actually bedtime. I've simply asserted bedtime. I gave them the choice about how they get there, and they jump onto one of the tracks, missing the fact that both tracks lead them to bed, right? If I had said, do you want to stay up, watch television or go to bed? That's a different conversation, but I didn't frame things that way. And because I control the framing, because I control how the conversation plays out, I can get the outcome that I want. Soft power is a really useful approach, and it's a different way of thinking about power operating in the international system that focuses a lot more on the position you have within organizations and the diplomatic tools that you have, rather than the ability to bribe and coerce that we see oftentimes focused on with more hard power carrots and sticks.